500 princesses compete for the vampire king's hand at the ball, but all he wants is his poor maid. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into our story. In the grand city of Blackstone, where wealth and power reign, the most prestigious event of the year was about to take place. The Ball of the Vampire King. The night was set with towering crystal chandeliers and the scent of roses in the air. Thousands of guests from all corners of the world filled the grand hall. But there was one thing that made this ball even more extraordinary. The Vampire King had announced that he would choose his queen from the finest ladies in the land. And so, 500 princesses, noble women, and heiresses had arrived, each one hoping to catch the Vampire King's attention. These were women of unmatched beauty, elegance, and power, dressed in gowns worth more than the average person's lifetime savings. But amongst all of them, one woman stood out. Or rather, she didn't. Lila, a simple maid, had been assigned to serve at the ball. She was not a guest, not a princess, and certainly not a candidate for the hand of the Vampire King. She was a lowly servant, her only task being to make sure the guests had everything they needed. Lila had always been different from the other women. While they were busy preening and perfecting their beauty for the king's gaze, she was content to stay out of the spotlight. She had no interest in the politics of the court, no desire for the riches and power that came with being by the king's side. Her world was simple: to serve, to work, and to make it through the day. Little did she know, tonight would change everything. The grand ballroom glittered under the lights as the dance began. Lila moved through the crowd, offering drinks and making sure every table was attended to. Her brown dress was plain compared to the magnificent gowns around her, and she kept her head down, avoiding the eyes of the noblemen and women who looked at her with disdain. She had worked here long enough to know that people like her were invisible to those who mattered. But then, something happened. As Lila was walking past a group of noble women, she accidentally bumped into one of the Vampire King's personal guards, spilling a drink on his uniform. She quickly apologized, her face turning bright red as she tried to clean up the mess. The guard, a towering man with sharp features, glared down at her. But before he could say anything, a deep voice interrupted. "It's all right," the voice said, low and commanding. Lila looked up and froze. Standing before her was the Vampire King himself. He was tall, with sharp, regal features and eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. His presence alone made the room feel colder, as though the very air had shifted. The Vampire King looked at her, his gaze piercing, as if he were studying her every move. "Are you the one who serves here?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft for someone with so much power. Lila nodded, still in shock. "Yes, Your Majesty," she stammered, her heart racing in her chest. The king's lips curled into the smallest of smiles. "You seem out of place among all these princesses," he remarked, his voice laced with amusement. Lila, unable to form a proper response, simply looked down at her shoes. "But you've caught my attention," he said, his tone turning more serious. "There's something about you that I cannot ignore." Lila felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She was just a maid. She had no business being the focus of the Vampire King's attention. But for reasons she couldn't explain, a part of her wanted to know why he was so drawn to her. Little did she know, this chance encounter would set the stage for a battle far greater than anything she could have imagined, one that would change the fate of both herself and the kingdom forever. As the night went on, the grand ballroom of the Vampire King's castle continued to glow with extravagant lights, the music flowing like a river through the marble halls. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the delicate hum of whispered conversations. Lila, her heart still racing from the brief encounter with the Vampire King, tried her best to stay out of sight as she continued to serve drinks and clear plates. Despite her best efforts to remain invisible, something was different now. The eyes of the guests seemed to follow her, some with curiosity, others with disdain. It was as if the room had somehow changed, and she had become a part of a drama that was far beyond her understanding. She could feel the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders as she moved through the crowd, her hands shaking slightly from the tension that had settled in her chest. Lila knew that in the world of the rich and powerful, people like her were nothing more than background noise, meant to serve without being seen. But then, out of nowhere, the Vampire King's voice cut through the crowd once again. "You there," he called out, his commanding tone instantly silencing the noise around her. Lila froze, the glass she was holding nearly slipping from her hand. She looked up, and there he was, standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the glittering elite, his eyes locked on hers. "Come here," he ordered, his voice calm but unwavering. With her heart pounding in her chest, Lila made her way toward him, each step feeling like it was happening in slow motion. As she approached, the other women in the room whispered, casting judgmental glances her way. She had never felt so exposed, so out of place. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The Vampire King turned to face her fully, his gaze intense, as if he could see straight through her. "You are the Maid," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "I have never seen someone like you before, not here." Lila swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied quietly, avoiding his gaze. She was just a maid, after all, a simple servant in a world of unimaginable wealth and power. "Why are you not participating in the festivities?" he asked, his voice now softer, almost intrigued. "Aren't you curious? Don't you wish to be one of them?" He gestured to the sea of princesses and noble women who surrounded them, all vying for his attention. Lila shook her head, unsure of what to say. "No, Your Majesty. I'm just here to do my job," she stammered. The Vampire King studied her for a long moment, as if he was trying to read her soul. Then, with a subtle tilt of his head, he spoke again. "You do not play the game of power, do you?" he asked, his voice tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "No, Your Majesty. I don't know how," she whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. He smiled then, a small but knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then perhaps it is time you learned," he said, almost to himself. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. And then, just as suddenly as he had called her over, the Vampire King turned his attention to someone else, a flicker of disinterest in his gaze. Lila's heart, which had been racing since their first encounter, began to slow, the tension lifting from her shoulders as she quickly backed away. As she returned to her duties, the realization began to settle in. The Vampire King had spoken to her. He had noticed her, and it was not a simple mistake. It was something else, something more dangerous. She tried to shake the thought from her mind, but it lingered, gnawing at her. What did he want with her? Why was he so intrigued? And what did this mean for her future? With every passing minute, the ball seemed to grow darker, the air thicker with the tension of something unknown. Lila had no idea that she had just stepped into a world of politics and intrigue that would change her life forever. The night, which had started as just another ordinary evening in the castle, was about to take a turn that no one, not even the Vampire King himself, could have predicted. The night wore on, and Lila continued her work in the grand ballroom, but her mind was far from the tasks at hand. The Vampire King's words echoed in her head, a constant reminder of the strange connection that had formed between them. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that her life was heading in a direction she couldn't control. As the guests danced, laughed, and mingled, Lila found herself on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if the king would call for her again. She tried to focus on her work, serving drinks and clearing plates, but her hands trembled slightly with every step. She couldn't ignore the eyes that followed her, some curious, others envious. The whispers of the other women in the room seemed louder now, their judgmental stares harder to ignore. They were all beautiful, dressed in opulent gowns that glittered in the candlelight, and yet the king had noticed her. A simple maid. What could it mean? Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a hand gently touch her arm. She looked up to see one of the guards standing before her, his face serious. "The king requests your presence," he said, his voice low. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had barely spoken to him, and yet he had asked for her again. She followed the guard through the maze of guests, her heart pounding in her chest. As they approached the king, she noticed the same intense gaze he had given her earlier. He was standing near the edge of the ballroom, away from the crowds, as if waiting for something or someone. When he saw Lila approaching, his lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained unreadable. "I've been watching you," he said quietly, his voice only for her ears. "You don't belong here, do you?" Lila stiffened, unsure how to respond. "No, Your Majesty. I'm just a servant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The king regarded her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. "I don't think that's true," he said, his gaze piercing. "You don't play by the rules like the others. You don't seek attention, and yet, here you are, standing before me." Lila felt a shiver run down her spine at the intensity of his gaze. "I don't want attention," she said softly, trying to steady her nerves. "I only want to do my job." The king seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "Perhaps that's what makes you different. That is why I've chosen to speak with you again." Lila's mind raced. Chosen? Why her? There were countless women in the room, all far more beautiful and powerful than she could ever hope to be. "I don't understand, Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why me?" The king took a step closer, his presence so overwhelming that Lila felt herself take a small step back. "I'm not like the others. I don't want someone who only seeks power or status. I want someone real. Someone who doesn't hide behind a mask of perfection." Lila swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I'm just a maid," she said, feeling foolish for repeating the obvious. The king's eyes softened, though his expression remained serious. "You are more than that," he said quietly, "and I'm starting to think that you are exactly what I need." Lila's mind was spinning. She had no idea what the king meant, but she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt whenever he was near. It was as if everything else faded away, leaving only the two of them in the room. She didn't know what it was, but there was something magnetic about him. Something powerful, yet dangerous. The king turned slightly, his gaze drifting back to the crowd. "Come with me," he said, his tone still calm but firm. "I want to show you something." Lila hesitated for only a moment before following him, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. They moved through the ballroom, past the crowds of laughing guests, until they reached a private balcony overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking. The lights of the city stretched out beneath them like a sea of stars, and the night air was cool and refreshing. The king leaned on the railing, looking out at the view with a thoughtful expression. "I've spent centuries alone," he said quietly, as if speaking to himself. "Surrounded by people, yes, but alone all the same." Lila wasn't sure how to respond. She had never been alone in the way the king seemed to be describing. She had always had her family, her work, her life in the castle, even if it was humble. "Why are you telling me this, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice soft. The king turned to her then, his eyes filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Because I think you understand," he said. "You've always been on the outside, looking in. You know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like you don't belong." Lila felt a lump form in her throat. It was true. She had always been on the outside, never fully part of the world she lived in. "You're right," she said quietly. "But that doesn't mean I'm ready for the life you lead, Your Majesty." The king took a deep breath, as if weighing her words. "I know," he said finally, "but you might be. In time." The silence that followed was heavy, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Lila felt a strange sense of calm settle over her, as if she were standing on the edge of something far greater than she could have imagined. What had started as just another night in the castle was turning into something much more complicated, something she couldn't yet understand. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. As the night unfolded, Lila's mind continued to race, her thoughts still tangled with the vampire king's cryptic words. She stood beside him on the balcony, the wind lightly brushing against her face as the view of Blackstone's city lights shimmered below. But despite the beauty of the moment, a heavy tension hung between them, a weight neither of them acknowledged. Lila had never been so close to a man like him, a man who exuded such power and danger. She had seen his cold eyes, felt the unspoken promises in his voice, and it left her feeling both frightened and intrigued. He had chosen her, but for what purpose? What could a simple maid like her possibly offer the vampire king? She wasn't a noble woman, nor was she beautiful like the princesses who had come to compete for his favor. Yet here she was, standing at his side. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice quieter now, as though trying to make sense of it all. The king didn't answer right away, instead turning his gaze back to the city. You remind me of something I've lost, he said, his voice distant, almost regretful. Lila couldn't make sense of his words. What have you lost, your majesty? She asked, curiosity edging her tone. He glanced at her, a fleeting glimmer of something dark crossing his eyes. My humanity, he whispered. My connection to the world of the living. I have been surrounded by vampires and nobles for centuries, but none of them understand. None of them feel the way I do. The words hung in the air, heavy and filled with sorrow. Lila didn't know how to respond. She had never imagined a being like the Vampire King could feel anything remotely human. She had always assumed that those with such power were beyond emotions like sadness or longing. But now, in this quiet moment with him, she began to see him differently. He was not just the ruler of all vampires, cold and impervious to the world. He was a man, a creature who had lived far too long, too removed from the things that truly mattered. I don't know if I can understand, but I do know what it's like to feel out of place, she said softly, her own voice carrying the weight of her own loneliness. The king turned to her, his intense gaze locking with hers. Do you? He asked, almost searching. How so? Lila hesitated, unsure if she should share the truth of her life with him. She was just a maid, after all, someone who had lived a life of servitude and solitude. But in that moment, standing in the presence of the Vampire King, she felt a strange sense of connection to him, as if they both shared something deep and hidden. I have spent my life on the outside, she admitted, her words slow but steady. I've always been invisible to those around me. People see me only for what I can do for them, not for who I am. I've never felt like I truly belonged anywhere, not among the wealthy, not among the servants, not anywhere. The king's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained as sharp and unreadable as ever. Perhaps that's why I've noticed you, he said quietly. You're different. You don't play the same games as the others. Lila frowned, unsure of how to interpret his words. The games? She asked. The king nodded, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. The games they play to gain power, to win favor, to climb the ladder. I am surrounded by people who constantly scheme, who think only of how to further their own interests. But you. He paused, as if considering the next words carefully. You are not like them. You are genuine. You are real. Lila felt her cheeks flush at his words, unsure of how to react. She had always believed her life to be insignificant, that she was nothing more than a tool to be used by those in power. To hear the Vampire King speak of her in such a way was both flattering and overwhelming. I don't know how to be anything else, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I've never had the chance to be anything else. The king studied her for a long moment before responding. Perhaps that's why I've chosen to keep you near me, he said softly. I've seen something in you, Lila. Something that none of the others possess. You are real, and in a world where everything is tainted by power and lies, that is something I need. The weight of his words sank into her chest, and for a moment, she felt the urge to step away, to escape from the intensity of the moment. But she couldn't. She found herself drawn to him, despite the fear that curled in her stomach. There was something about him, something that made her heart race and her mind swirl with questions. What do you want from me? She asked, finally daring to ask the question that had been on her mind since the night had begun. The king's gaze softened once again, his eyes searching hers with a depth that sent a shiver down her spine. I want your loyalty, he said, his voice low but firm. Not because I demand it, but because I believe you are someone who can see the world as it is, not as it's been shaped by power and greed. And perhaps, in time, you'll learn to trust me as I trust you. Lila didn't know what to say. The idea of trusting someone like him, a creature so powerful, so distant from everything she knew, was both terrifying and thrilling. But as the night stretched on, she realized that she couldn't escape from the web that had been spun around her. The Vampire King had seen something in her, and now she was trapped in his world. A world of power, danger, and intrigue that was unlike anything she had ever known. But despite the fear, there was something else in her heart, something that told her she couldn't walk away, no matter how much she wanted to. The Vampire King had chosen her, and now, her fate was inextricably tied to his. As the days passed in the castle, Lila's life began to change in ways she couldn't have predicted. The vampire king's presence lingered in every corner of the grand estate, and though he remained as enigmatic as ever, she couldn't escape the growing sense that her place here was not just as a maid. She found herself being drawn into his world in a way that both fascinated and terrified her. The king had asked for her loyalty, and though the words had sounded simple at the time, she realized now just how much those words meant. It wasn't just about being obedient. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. She spent her days in the castle, still performing her duties, but now there was always a lingering awareness in the air. The other servants treated her differently, some with envy, others with suspicion, as if they could sense the shift in her position. But it was the moments she spent with the vampire king that weighed the heaviest on her heart. He would often call for her in private, and each time, it felt like stepping into a world she didn't fully understand. His power was palpable, and though he had shown her kindness in small ways, she never forgot who he was. He was a vampire king, an ancient, immortal being with the weight of centuries of rule on his shoulders. And she was just a simple maid, a girl who had never known anything but the humdrum life of serving others. It was in one of these private meetings that Lila realized just how much she had changed since meeting him. The king had invited her to his study, a grand room filled with ancient books, scrolls, and artifacts that seemed to pulse with history. He was sitting at a large wooden desk, his fingers tracing the edges of an old map, and when he saw her enter, he looked up with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've become more comfortable here," he observed, his voice soft but observant. Lila hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I suppose I have," she admitted. "But it's still hard to believe. Every day feels like I'm in a dream." The king's gaze softened, though his eyes still held a mystery Lila could never quite decipher. "It's not a dream, Lila. This is your reality now." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her, and she quickly turned her gaze away, her thoughts racing. "But this world, it's not my world," she said quietly. "I'm just a maid. I don't belong here with people like you." The king stood up then, moving toward her with surprising speed. He was close now, just a few feet away, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room. "Why do you say that?" he asked, his voice soft, yet carrying a weight that made Lila's heart race. "You are more than what you believe you are." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what you mean." The king studied her for a moment, his eyes piercing into hers. "You've always felt like an outsider, haven't you?" he asked, his voice gentle but cutting through her defenses. Lila's heart sank. How could he know that? How could he understand the emptiness she had felt for so long? "Yes," she whispered. "I've never really belonged anywhere. Not among the rich or the poor. Always just on the outside looking in." The king's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Lila saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that made her chest ache. "I've been alone for centuries, Lila," he said quietly. "Surrounded by people, but always alone. I thought I was beyond feeling, beyond caring. But then you came into my life." Lila's breath caught in her throat as he stepped closer. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, and her pulse quickened in response. "What are you saying?" she asked, barely able to whisper the words. The king's hand reached out, gently cupping her face, and Lila's heart raced. "I'm saying that I've found something in you," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Something real, something I've been searching for." Lila's mind spun, and she tried to pull away, but his touch was firm, his fingers warm against her skin. She didn't understand what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was just a maid. He was the vampire king. "Your Majesty," she breathed, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to." "You don't have to know," he interrupted, his voice soft but filled with determination. "Just trust me, Lila. Trust that what we have is real." The room seemed to close in around her, and for the first time since meeting him, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in years. But there was also fear, a fear she couldn't shake. Fear of what this might mean for her, for the life she had known. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her, that the vampire king, a creature of such immense power and darkness, could feel anything for someone like her. She was nothing, and yet, he had seen something in her. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you." The king's hand gently stroked her cheek, and his eyes softened. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said quietly, "but trust that I won't hurt you." Lila closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions rushing through her. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, standing in front of the Vampire King, she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. The days following the intimate conversation on the balcony were a blur for Lila. She couldn't shake the feeling of the king's touch on her skin, or the weight of his words that had lingered long after they'd parted. Her life had shifted, and despite her attempts to return to the simplicity of her duties, everything felt different. She was no longer just a maid in the Vampire King's court. No, she was something more now, whether she liked it or not. The castle was still as vast and imposing as ever, but now Lila moved through it with a sense of purpose, her steps heavy with the knowledge that the king had taken an interest in her. The servants eyed her with a mix of curiosity and envy, as if they too could feel the shift in the air. As much as Lila tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but sense the growing distance between herself and the others. They were all still wrapped up in their own lives, while hers had become entwined with that of the Vampire King. One afternoon, as Lila was polishing the marble floors of the grand hall, a sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. "You seem preoccupied, Lila." She looked up to find the king standing before her, his presence commanding the space around him. His eyes, those ancient eyes, held an unreadable expression as he watched her work. "Your Majesty," Lila said, quickly standing up and curtsying, though she felt a strange flutter in her chest. "I didn't expect to see you here," he offered. A small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and stepped closer. "I thought I would find you here, in this quiet place. It seems to suit you," he said, his gaze flicking to the polished floors beneath her. "You like to be unnoticed, don't you?" Lila lowered her eyes, her hands twisting the cloth nervously. "I've always been used to it. It's easier this way," she replied, her voice soft. The king studied her for a moment before speaking again. "And yet, you're not invisible to me, Lila." She felt a rush of heat flood her face at his words. The weight of his gaze was heavy, and she found herself struggling to maintain her composure. "I don't understand," she whispered, not sure if she was asking about his words or the feeling that had taken root in her chest. The king's expression softened slightly. "You don't need to understand just yet," he said gently. "But in time you will." There was something in his tone that made her stomach tighten, a sense of inevitability she couldn't escape. "Why do you need me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. He looked at her, a flicker of something ancient in his eyes. "Because I see something in you that I haven't seen in centuries," he said, his voice low and intense. "I've spent so long in this cold, lonely world, surrounded by lies and power plays. You are the first person to show me something real." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him speak so openly, so vulnerably. It was a side of him she hadn't expected to see. "But I'm just a maid," she said, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. "I have no place in your world." The king took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "That's where you're wrong, Lila," he said softly. "You have every place in this world, if you choose to take it." His words struck her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she was at a loss for what to say. She had always been content with her simple life, never expecting anything more than the duties of a maid. And now, the king was offering her a place in his world, a world she wasn't sure she was ready for. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want you to stand by my side," he said, his voice quiet but filled with an unmistakable command. "I want your loyalty, your trust, and your heart. I want to build something with you, something real in a world full of pretense." Lila's heart raced as she processed his words. This wasn't just a simple request. This was an invitation into a life that she could never have imagined. A life beside the Vampire King, a life filled with power, danger, and unimaginable consequences. "But I'm not like the women you know," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't have beauty or power. I'm just me." The king's expression softened, and for a moment, he reached out, brushing his fingers against her cheek in the gentlest of touches. "That's exactly why I need you, Lila," he said quietly. "You are real. You are honest. In a world of deception, that is more valuable than anything else." The tenderness in his touch made her pulse quicken, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if it was possible to trust him. She had always kept her heart guarded, afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to care. But standing in front of the vampire king, with his hand gently cupping her face, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything that had happened between them. "What if I can't trust you?" she whispered, the fear in her voice betraying her. The king's eyes softened, and he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. "Then you will learn to, in time," he said gently. "And I will wait for that time to come." Lila closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She had a choice to make, and the path ahead was uncertain. But in this moment, she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and confusion for Lila. The vampire king's presence in her life had only grown stronger, and with each passing moment, she found herself more and more drawn to him. His words, his touch, they lingered in her thoughts, and though she tried to push them aside, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt towards him. She had always lived a simple life, far removed from the complexities of royalty and power. But now, she was living in the heart of a world that was as dangerous as it was alluring. She had come to the castle as a maid, and yet, here she was, entangled in the world of the vampire king. She could no longer pretend she was just a simple servant. The king had shown her a side of him that no one else had seen, a vulnerability that contradicted the cold, powerful ruler she had always known. But even with this new closeness, Lila still couldn't fully trust him. She wasn't sure if it was because of his power or because of the way he made her feel, something she hadn't experienced before. A desire to be seen, to be understood, to be more than just a maid. But with that desire came fear. The fear that if she allowed herself to get too close, she would lose herself in his world. And yet, every time she was near him, that fear seemed to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of longing. One evening, after another quiet conversation with the king, Lila found herself alone in her chambers, the weight of his words still heavy on her mind. She stared out the window, the city lights of Blackstone stretching out before her like a sea of stars. It was a beautiful sight, but it did little to ease the confusion inside her. She was torn between two worlds, one that was familiar and safe, and one that was full of danger, intrigue, and the unknown. She had spent most of her life hiding in the shadows, content to be invisible. But now, with the king's attention on her, she couldn't help but feel exposed. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the kind of life he was offering her. The life of a queen, a partner to someone as powerful and ancient as him. She had always believed that love, loyalty, and trust were earned, not given freely. And yet, here she was, struggling with the growing feelings she had for him. The door to her chamber creaked open, and Lila quickly turned, startled. The vampire king stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room. His eyes, always so intense, softened when they met hers, and for a moment, it felt as if the rest of the world had faded away. "Lila," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that she rarely heard from him. "You've been distant these past few days. Is something wrong?" Lila swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I don't know what to think anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything has changed. You've changed everything." The king stepped forward, his gaze never leaving her. "I know I've asked a lot of you," he said, his tone earnest. "But I need you to understand, Lila. What we have, it's not just a fleeting thing for me. You are more to me than anyone I've known in centuries." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and though part of her wanted to pull away, another part of her ached to close the distance between them. "I don't know if I can be what you want," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm just a maid. I don't belong in your world." The king's eyes darkened, and he reached out, his fingers gently lifting her chin so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You belong with me," he said, his voice firm, yet tender. "I've chosen you, Lila. I want you by my side, now and always." His words were like a promise, a binding vow that Lila couldn't escape, even if she wanted to. She felt the weight of his gaze, the gravity of his feelings, and in that moment, she realized that she had a choice to make. She could walk away, return to her life as a servant, invisible and forgotten. Or, she could stay and step into a new life, one that was filled with power, danger, and the unknown. A life with the Vampire King. The thought of leaving him, of turning her back on everything he was offering, seemed impossible. And yet, the fear still gnawed at her. Could she really be a part of his world? A world of immortality, of ancient politics and rivalries, of darkness and light? I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered, her voice trembling. The king's expression softened, and he brushed a lock of hair from her face, his touch gentle. You don't have to trust me all at once, he said quietly. But know this, Lila, I will never hurt you. You are safe with me. His words, so simple yet so full of promise, made her heart flutter. She didn't know if she could trust him completely, but in that moment, she wanted to. She wanted to believe that he would keep her safe, that he wasn't just another powerful man playing a game. She wanted to believe that he saw something in her, something real. What if I'm not enough for you? She asked, the fear spilling out before she could stop it. The king smiled softly, the sadness in his eyes giving way to something more tender. You are more than enough, Lila. You are everything I need. The warmth of his words washed over her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace. In his presence, she no longer felt invisible. She was someone. She was Lila, and that was enough. The days following their conversation were filled with an undeniable tension that lingered in the air. Lila tried her best to return to her routine, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The Vampire King's presence, his words, and the promise he had made to her weighed heavily on her. Every time she walked through the halls of the castle, her heart raced, and she found herself constantly searching for him, wondering when he would seek her out again. And he did, of course. Every moment they spent together seemed to pull her deeper into a world she had never imagined, a world of ancient power, endless possibilities, and the ever-present threat of danger. It was on one such day, while she was tending to the garden outside the castle, that she felt his presence before she even saw him. The air shifted, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew he was near. Slowly, she turned around, and there he stood, his dark figure framed by the setting sun. His eyes locked with hers, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. Lila, he said, his voice as deep and smooth as it had been the first time they had spoken. I see you found some peace in the garden. Lila tried to steady her breath, but the sight of him always took her by surprise. I was just thinking, she said, her voice trembling slightly. About what you said. About trust. The king's expression softened, and he took a few steps toward her, his presence undeniable. And what did you decide? He asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Lila hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. I want to trust you, she said finally, her voice small. But there's so much at stake. I don't know if I'm ready for everything that comes with it. The king studied her for a moment, his gaze intense and knowing. He stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming. You don't have to be ready, Lila, he said softly, his fingers brushing against her arm. Trust doesn't come with a set timeline. It comes when you're willing to open your heart, even if just a little. She shivered at the warmth of his touch, and her heart skipped a beat. I don't know if I can give you everything you want, she whispered. The king's eyes softened, and for a moment, Lila saw something vulnerable in him, something she hadn't seen before. I'm not asking for everything, Lila, he said gently. I'm asking for you. Your honesty, your heart. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to trust me. The sincerity in his voice was overwhelming, and Lila felt her resolve weakening. She had spent so much of her life protecting herself from the world, from people who only wanted to use her. But the king wasn't like them. He had shown her sides of himself that she had never imagined, a side that was kind, patient, and, dare she say it, vulnerable. She had never expected to find something real in this world, especially not in someone like him. But here she was, struggling with feelings she couldn't ignore. What if I'm not enough? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I can't be what you need? The king took another step closer, his face softening as he cupped her face gently with his hand. Lila, he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. You are more than enough. You always have been. You just need to believe that. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world around them faded, leaving only the two of them standing in the fading sunlight. Lila's heart ached, and she realized in that moment that she could no longer deny the feeling she had for him. She had tried to keep her distance, to remain the invisible maid she had always been, but it was too late. She had already given him a piece of her heart. The king leaned down, his lips brushing softly against her forehead. Trust takes time, he said quietly. But I'm willing to wait for you, Lila. I always will. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she found herself leaning into his touch, craving the closeness he was offering. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. The king had given her a choice that would change everything. And in that moment, standing in his arms, she knew she was ready to take it. I don't know what the future holds, she said softly, looking up at him. But I want to find out. With you. The king smiled then, a smile that reached his eyes, and for the first time, Lila felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had made her choice. She would trust him, and together, they would face whatever challenges the future held. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, the bond between Lila and the Vampire King only deepened. She had chosen to trust him, to step into his world, and though the path was filled with uncertainty, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Each moment spent with him was both terrifying and exhilarating. Like walking along the edge of a cliff, one misstep could send her tumbling, but the view was unlike anything she had ever seen. The king, though powerful and ancient, seemed more human with each passing day. His vulnerability, his willingness to open up to her, was something she hadn't expected, and yet, it was what had drawn her to him from the very beginning. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, unimportant. But now, in his presence, she was seen. She mattered. But despite the growing closeness, there were still many questions left unanswered. What did this relationship truly mean? What would it cost her? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, what did the other vampires think? The politics of the vampire world were never far from her mind. She knew the king had powerful enemies, rivals who would stop at nothing to see him fall, and she couldn't help but wonder where she fit into that dangerous equation. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting the castle in a golden light, Lila found herself once again in the king's study. He had asked for her, as he often did now, and though she was still unsure of the reasons behind it, she couldn't bring herself to stay away. She entered quietly, her heart beating faster than usual as she saw him standing by the window, looking out over the vast grounds of the castle. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Lila, he said softly, his voice filled with warmth. I need to speak with you. Lila nodded, though her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What is it, Your Majesty? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The king stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I want you to understand something, he began, his tone serious. The world we live in, my world, is not kind to those who are weak. And you, Lila, have shown me a strength I didn't expect. She swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. I don't know if I'm strong, she whispered. I've spent so much of my life hiding, pretending to be invisible. The king's expression softened, and he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You are stronger than you realize, and that strength will be needed if you are to stand beside me. Lila's heart raced as the implications of his words began to sink in. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you need me to do? The king's eyes darkened, and for a moment, he seemed to be considering how best to explain. There are enemies who would see me destroyed, he said quietly. They want to take my throne, to tear apart everything I've built, and they will stop at nothing to do it. Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. She had known there were dangers, but hearing him speak so openly about them made it all the more real. But why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why involve me in all of this? The king's gaze softened once more, and he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in its intensity. Because, Lila, he said quietly, I trust you. I need you. She didn't know what to say. How could she possibly understand the weight of the world the king carried on his shoulders? She was just a maid, someone who had never imagined a life like this, let alone one filled with such high stakes. But even as the fear gripped her, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. She wanted to be by his side, to help him in whatever way she could. What do you need me to do? She asked again, this time with more resolve. The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. I need you to stand with me, he said, his voice low and steady. To be my partner in this fight. The world will see you by my side, and that will make them question everything they think they know about me. Lila took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She knew this was a turning point, a moment she couldn't take back. Standing by him, supporting him, would change everything. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: hope. The king was not just asking her to be his partner in power. He was asking her to stand with him through the darkness, to be a light in a world that often seemed consumed by it. I will stand with you, she said, her voice strong despite the fear bubbling up inside her. Whatever happens, I will stand by your side. The king's eyes softened, a rare warmth in his gaze. Thank you, Lila, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You have no idea what this means to me. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows, Lila realized that she had made her choice. There was no going back now. She had chosen to stand with the Vampire King, to fight beside him in a world that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. And she would face whatever came next, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was not alone. The weeks following Lila's decision to stand by the Vampire King were filled with new challenges and deeper realizations. The weight of her choice had settled heavily upon her shoulders, but she found herself more determined than ever to prove that she belonged by his side. Despite the fear and uncertainty that had initially gripped her, there was something undeniable about the way her heart responded to him. She had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. Each day, the king continued to reveal more of himself to her, and though she had always seen him as a ruler, a man of immense power and control, she was beginning to understand that there was so much more beneath the surface. The king wasn't just a monarch with untold power. He was a man haunted by centuries of solitude, a man who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from the world. And now, he had let her in. In the beginning, Lila had wondered if it was truly possible for someone like her to fit into his world, to be anything more than a passing curiosity to a creature as ancient as the Vampire King. But with every passing day, she found herself more entwined in his life, more involved in his kingdom's delicate web of power and politics. Their relationship, though still new, was already fraught with complexity. And it seemed that just as Lila was beginning to understand the rules of this dangerous game, everything was about to change. One evening, as Lila wandered the castle's expansive gardens, the sound of footsteps behind her caused her to turn. She found herself face to face with one of the king's most trusted advisors, a tall and imposing figure with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through her. He had always treated her with a certain coldness, and Lila couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine as he approached. Lila, he said, his voice low and almost menacing. The king has been distracted recently. It's become clear that he is investing more time in you than in the matters that truly matter. Lila's heart raced, and she tried to keep her voice steady. I don't understand, she replied. What matters more than what the king chooses to do with his time? The advisor's eyes narrowed. You may not understand, but I think you should. The king's attention is a powerful thing, but it is also a dangerous one. There are those who will use your closeness to him against you, and there are those who would like to see you removed from the picture entirely. Lila felt her pulse quicken at his words, but she stood tall, meeting his gaze with defiance. I don't intend to be used, and I don't plan to go anywhere, she said firmly. The advisor studied her for a moment, as though weighing her resolve. You should be careful, Lila. The world of the vampires is not kind to those who do not understand its intricacies. And right now, you are nothing but a pawn in a game that you do not fully comprehend. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lila standing there, her mind racing with the implications of his words. She knew the vampire world was filled with rivalries and power struggles, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous her position could be. She had thought her relationship with the king would be something simple, something real, but now she saw that the complexities of his world were far more than she had ever imagined. She couldn't ignore the warning, and she certainly couldn't ignore the fear that gnawed at her. But what troubled her more than anything was the realization that the advisor's words were not entirely without merit. She had become the center of attention, and not just from the king. She had become a symbol of power, a reminder of the king's humanity and vulnerability. And in the world of vampires, those who had such power rarely held on to it for long. As Lila returned to her chambers that night, her mind raced with questions. Was she truly ready for the world she had stepped into? Could she handle the dangers and manipulations that came with being the king's closest confidant? And more importantly, did the king realize just how much danger they were both in? The thought of losing him, of losing the connection they had forged, made her heart ache. She had never thought she would care for someone like him, someone so powerful and dangerous. But now, she couldn't imagine a life without him. The decision she had made to trust him was not without its cost. But she was determined not to let that cost be her undoing. Lila knew the risks, but she also knew that she couldn't turn her back on the king now. He needed her, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a purpose. As the days turned into weeks, the danger in the air grew thicker. The king's enemies, those who had always lurked in the shadows, were becoming bolder. It was clear that they were not content to let him rule freely, and they would stop at nothing to bring him down. Lila had to be ready. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for him. The stakes were higher than ever, and though she was terrified of what the future held, one thing was certain. She was in this fight, alongside the vampire king, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the castle had changed since the vampire king's enemies began to make their move. What had once been a place of relative peace and order had become a quiet battleground, with tension hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The king's enemies were no longer lurking in the shadows. They were making their intentions known, and it was clear they wanted more than just power. They wanted to destroy everything the king had built, including the fragile bond that had formed between him and Lila. Every day felt like a new test. She had always known that her place by the king's side would not come without challenges, but now, those challenges were no longer distant rumors or whispers. They were real, and they were knocking at the door. The king had made it clear that he wanted her with him, standing by his side, but Lila couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility she had accepted. She wasn't just the king's confidant anymore. She was his partner, and every decision she made now had the potential to affect more than just her own life. It was late one evening when Lila found herself standing before the king in his private chambers. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of candlelight, and the air felt thick with the tension that had been building between them. He was seated at his desk, looking over documents, as he often did in these quiet hours of the night. But tonight, there was something different about him. His usual calm demeanor seemed to be slipping, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed vulnerable. She could see it in the way his shoulders were tense, the subtle furrow of his brow as he read through the papers before him. "Your Majesty," she said softly, breaking the silence. He looked up, his piercing gaze meeting hers. "Lila," he said, his voice heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I didn't hear you come in." She stepped closer, standing at the edge of the desk. "You've been working late again," she observed. "Is everything all right?" The king sighed and leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment as though trying to gather his thoughts. "The rebellion is growing," he said quietly. "More of my enemies are rallying together. They're not going to stop until I'm gone. And they know that the key to destroying everything I've built is to destroy what matters most to me." Lila's heart clenched at his words. She knew the stakes were high, but hearing him admit it so openly made everything feel more real than ever before. "They know about us," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "And they'll use you against me if they can. That's why I need to protect you." The weight of his words settled heavily on her. Protect her. He was willing to put her in danger to protect his own kingdom, his own power. But Lila couldn't just sit back and allow that to happen. She had made a choice, to stand by him, to trust him, and she wasn't about to back down now. "I can't just hide away while you fight this battle alone," she said, her voice unwavering. The king looked at her, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. "Lila, I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to stay safe. You don't belong in the middle of this war." Lila stepped closer to him, her heart racing as she placed her hand gently on his. "I'm already in the middle of it, Your Majesty. I've chosen to stand by your side. You don't have to protect me by keeping me in the shadows." The king's eyes softened, but there was still a flicker of concern in them. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. Lila felt a lump form in her throat. She could see how much the weight of everything was affecting him. The king, who had spent centuries ruling with unshakable strength, was showing a side of himself she had never seen before, a side of vulnerability, of fear. She realized then that, like her, he wasn't invincible. He had his own fears, his own insecurities, and the thought of losing her was a burden he wasn't willing to bear. "You won't lose me," she said softly, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The king looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense, as if searching her face for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he nodded, his lips curling into a faint, yet genuine smile. "Then we face this together," he said, his voice steady once more. "We fight this battle together." And in that moment, Lila knew there was no turning back. They were in this together, no matter what the future held. The darkness that had been growing around them was undeniable, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She would face it with him, standing by his side, no matter the cost. The rebellion, the political games, the enemies that sought to tear them apart, they didn't matter. What mattered was the choice they had both made to trust each other, to fight for something real, something worth protecting. As the night stretched on and the castle stood silent, Lila knew that the days ahead would be filled with uncertainty and danger. But for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a pawn in a game of power. She was his partner, his equal, and together, they would face whatever came next. The days that followed Lila's decision to stand by the king's side felt like a constant balancing act. Every decision, every step she took, carried the weight of their future. The rebellion was growing stronger with each passing day, and the enemies of the vampire king were becoming bolder. They weren't just after the throne. This wasn't just about power. It was about control, about breaking the king and everything he stood for. And now, with Lila so closely tied to him, it was clear they would stop at nothing to destroy everything they had built together. She had become a symbol, something more than just the king's maid, more than just a companion. To the rebels and their supporters, she represented something dangerous, the king's vulnerability. She knew she wasn't just an innocent bystander in this war, she was a target. The king had made it clear that he wanted to protect her, but Lila couldn't help but feel the cold grip of fear tighten around her chest every time she thought about what could happen. As the days grew darker and the danger more immediate, Lila knew she had to be stronger. She couldn't hide away. The king needed her now more than ever. It was a night like any other, though the tension in the air was palpable. The castle, usually filled with the soft sounds of servants going about their work, now felt eerily quiet. It was as though everyone in the kingdom was holding their breath, waiting for the storm to hit. Lila sat by the fire in her chambers, her fingers gently tracing the edges of a letter from the king, his words comforting yet tinged with a sense of finality. He had called her to meet him in his private chambers, and though she tried to push down the flutter of nervousness in her stomach, it was hard to ignore. She had come to understand that whenever the king asked for her presence, it meant something significant was about to unfold. She rose from her seat, her steps steady as she made her way to his room. The hallway was silent, and as she approached the door, her heart began to race. She took a deep breath and knocked softly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the castle. "Enter," came the king's voice, low and steady. Lila stepped into the room, her gaze immediately meeting his. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened sky. The storm had arrived. The wind howled outside, a stark contrast to the quiet calm of the room. The king turned to face her, his eyes dark with concern, but also with something else, determination. "Lila," he said softly, his voice filled with a gravity that sent a chill down her spine. "Things are moving faster than I expected. The rebels have made their move. There will be no turning back after tonight." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the whispers of a planned attack, but hearing it confirmed in such a stark way was different. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. The king stepped closer to her, his gaze intense. "We fight back," he said, his voice unwavering. "We show them that I am not easily defeated. I will not let them tear this kingdom apart, not while I still stand." Lila felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had known this was coming, but now that it was finally here, it felt real. Too real. "And where do I fit into this, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The king's eyes softened, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are more than just a symbol now, Lila," he said quietly. You are my partner, and this kingdom's future depends on both of us standing strong. We face this together, or not at all. Lila nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of fear and pride. She had chosen to stand with him, and now there was no turning back. She was in this fight, just as he was. The weight of their responsibilities pressed down on her, but for the first time, she understood the depth of the king's trust in her. He wasn't just asking for her loyalty. He was asking for her strength, for her courage in the face of impossible odds. And though the fear still lingered, she knew she could not falter. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady now. The king's gaze never left hers. "I need you to help me lead," he said, his voice filled with both urgency and resolve. "I need you to show the people that we are united, that we will not be broken. I need you by my side when the battle begins." Lila felt the weight of his words, but she also felt something else, a fire, a fierce determination she had never known. She had always thought of herself as someone small, someone invisible, but now, standing with the king, she realized she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. "I will stand by you," she said, her voice unwavering. "We will face this together." The king's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw the man behind the crown, the one who had trusted her, who had allowed her into his world. He stepped forward and took her hand in his, the gesture simple but powerful. "Thank you," he whispered. "I couldn't do this without you." The moment lingered, and in it, Lila felt the weight of everything that was at stake. She knew the coming days would be filled with danger, but she was no longer afraid. She had made her choice, and she would stand by him, no matter what the future held. Together, they would fight for what they had built, for the future of their kingdom, and for the love they had found in the darkest of times. The battle had come. Lila could feel it in every tense nerve of her body as the sound of clashing swords, the shouts of warriors, and the pounding of hooves filled the air. The rebellion had launched its assault on the castle, and the war that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long had finally exploded. Yet, as the chaos unfolded around her, Lila remained steadfast, standing beside the vampire king, her heart filled with determination. She had chosen to fight with him, to be by his side, and she wouldn't let fear stand in the way of that promise. The king, as fierce and relentless as he had always been, showed no signs of weakness. His commands rang out, cutting through the air like a sharp blade, his authority undeniable even in the midst of the battle. They fought together, side by side, leading their forces against those who sought to destroy everything they had built. Lila had never imagined that her life would lead her to this moment. She had always lived in the shadows, unseen and unnoticed, but now, as she fought alongside the king, she felt more alive than ever. Her own strength, her own courage, surprised her. She had underestimated herself, but now, with the king's unwavering trust and her resolve, she had become more than just a maid. She was a force to be reckoned with. The battle raged on, and every moment seemed to stretch into eternity. Lila could hear the clash of metal, the cries of those who fell, and the thunder of the storm that seemed to rage as fiercely as the war itself. But through it all, she kept her focus. The king needed her, and she would not fail him. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the weight of centuries pressing down on him, but she also saw the strength in him, the same strength that had made him a king, that had made him unstoppable. She was no longer just a part of his world. She was the one who would fight to keep it together. As the battle neared its peak, the king fought fiercely, his power unmatched. But it was clear that the rebels had no intention of backing down. Lila, her sword in hand, moved swiftly through the battlefield, her heart focused on one goal, protecting him. They had become a team, the king and the maid, their bond stronger than any sword. In that moment, Lila knew she had found her place. This was the world she had chosen. This was the life she had fought for. The tide of battle shifted when the king's enemies, seeing their forces falter, began to retreat. Victory was within their grasp, but Lila could feel something stir in her heart, an unspoken sense of dread. She glanced over at the king, his figure illuminated by the flickering torches, standing at the front of their forces, unwavering. But even as the rebels began to fall back, a shadow moved among them. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she saw the assassin, cloaked in dark robes, slipping toward the king with a dagger raised high. Without thinking, Lila pushed through the chaos, her heart pounding, and threw herself at the assassin, knocking him off course. The dagger barely missed the king, grazing his arm as he turned to face the threat. The assassin's eyes widened with shock as Lila landed a blow, knocking the weapon from his grasp. "Lila!" The king's voice rang out, but there was no time for words. The assassin attempted to strike again, but Lila, fueled by the adrenaline of the moment, fought back with everything she had. She was no longer just a servant, no longer just the king's companion. She was his protector, and she would fight to the death if it meant keeping him safe. With a final, decisive strike, Lila brought the assassin to the ground, her breath ragged but her heart filled with an overwhelming sense of triumph. The king approached, his gaze intense as he took in the scene before him. "You saved me," he said, his voice filled with awe. Lila's chest heaved with the effort of the fight, but a small smile crept onto her face. "I told you, I wouldn't let you go through this alone," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. The king's gaze softened, and for the first time in the chaos of battle, he seemed truly at peace. He reached out and gently touched her arm, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through together. "You are more than I ever imagined, Lila," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of reverence. "You are my strength." The final retreat of the rebels marked the end of the battle, and with it, the beginning of a new era. The castle stood tall, its walls scarred but unbroken, just like the bond between the king and Lila. As the dawn began to break, casting a golden light over the battlefield, Lila stood beside him, knowing that this was only the beginning of their journey together. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together, as partners, as equals. No longer just a maid, no longer just a ruler. Together, they would be unstoppable. In this thrilling tale of power, loyalty, and betrayal, Lila, a simple maid, finds herself drawn into a world of darkness and intrigue with the vampire king. As the story unfolds, Lila chooses to stand by the king's side, navigating the dangerous world of political rivalries, battles, and growing threats from enemies who seek to destroy everything the king has built. As tensions rise, Lila discovers that her connection with the king is deeper than she ever imagined, and their bond becomes a beacon of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. In this captivating adventure, Lila faces life-or-death situations, from saving the king from an assassin to fighting beside him in the heat of battle. The twists and turns of this story showcase the complexities of love, trust, and power in the realm of vampire stories, where nothing is ever as it seems. As the king and Lila fight to protect their kingdom and their relationship, the stakes grow higher, and their courage is tested to the limits. Whether you are a fan of vampire stories or just enjoy gripping tales of loyalty and romance, this is a must-read for anyone who craves a story filled with mystery, danger, and deep emotional connections. Prepare for a journey through the darkness of vampire stories, where loyalty is everything and the cost of betrayal is steep. From the intense battle scenes to the tender moments shared between the king and Lila, this story is a roller coaster of emotions, proving that in the world of vampires, love and power are inextricably linked, and nothing can break their bond.